Hey, online campus, we are continuing our series Beyond Bored and Confused, where we're talking all about the Bible, how it functions as a library of 66 books telling one overarching story, and how we can better read and understand it. And today, we are going to take a closer look at a genre that makes up most of the New Testament, and that is the genre of letters. Of the 27 books in the New Testament, 21 of them fall under the category of letters. And letters back then were more like group texts than private emails or mail you might receive in your P.O. box, insofar as they were often directed at a community versus an individual. But, of course, there were some notable differences between group texts and first century letters, or another word for this is epistles. Epistles could be written by one person or by a team of people. Epistles were written to be read out loud to the audience it was addressed to, unlike group text. And because reception was worse than T-Mobile back then, a person was usually sent with the epistle to represent the author, and they would be responsible for making clarifications and answering any follow-up questions people might have about the letter. For instance, Phoebe played this role for the letter to the Romans. See Romans 16, 1-2 for that. Now, the New Testament letters or epistles can be divided into two categories: the letters written by Paul and the letters written by everyone else, which scholars call the general epistles. So for today, we are going to focus on just one of the two categories, and that being the letters of Paul. Because out of the 21 letters, 13 were written or co-written by Paul. And so any introduction to this genre should start with this dude. But also, Paul's letter, or better yet, how we have read and interpreted his letters, have arguably had the biggest influence in Western Christian thought and history, for better and for worse. So it's important for us to learn how to read his letters well, so that they might be a source of God's life-giving word and direction for our lives and for our communities. Now, reading Paul well requires us to pay attention to three things: author, context, and embodiment. Or, put more succinctly, ACE, as in if you want to ace reading the epistles or letters, then you are going to want to spend sufficient time familiarizing yourself with who wrote the letter, who the letter was written to, and how to best live it out today. So first, let's start with A for author and get familiar with Paul. According to Acts 22, Paul was born in Tarsus, a city that was well known for its educational opportunities. He moved from there to Jerusalem to study the Jewish scriptures, which is also known as the Torah, or to us as the Old Testament. His teacher was none other than the famous Rabbi Gamaliel, the successor to Hillel. If that means nothing to you, that's like learning how to cook from Gordon Ramsay, or being mentored in songwriting by Taylor Swift. Gamaliel was the GOAT when it came to the Torah. That Paul had this opportunity reveals that he came from a really wealthy background, that his family had connections, and that Paul was an exceptional student of the Old Testament. In fact, by the time Paul was 20, it's likely that he knew the Old Testament like the back of his hand, that he was proficient in Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin, and was a master rhetorician and writer. So here's the point I'm trying to make here. Paul was a brilliant thinker, a devout Jew, and also someone who was deeply committed to Jesus. And it's worth keeping all of this in mind whenever we read his letters for two reasons. First, there's this tendency to think that reading Paul is easy, straightforward, compared to the rest of the books of the Bible. Now, I agree that anyone can pick up Paul's letters, read it for themselves, and with the Holy Spirit's help, be able to learn about God's love, forgiveness, and the life we are called to in Jesus Christ. But at the same time, if we assume that everything Paul shares is straightforward and simple to understand, that we don't have to take time and care with his words, then we set ourselves up for failure. Even Peter, Jesus' disciple Peter himself, says this about Paul: his letters contain some things that are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort as they do other scriptures to their own destruction. So when it comes to Paul, we need to be careful, and we're going to talk more about why in just a bit. But here's the second point I want to make. Second, we also forget that Paul was a Jew who did not abandon being a Jew the moment he met Jesus. Instead, he understood and presented Jesus' kingdom message through the lens of his Jewish tradition and hope. Understanding this keeps us from interpreting Paul as being anti-Semitic, that is, anti-Jewish, which unfortunately has been a problem for over 2,000 years. But also this means the more we familiarize ourselves with the Old Testament, the more we are going to appreciate and get what Paul is trying to say about Jesus. Okay, so that's enough about Paul. Now, we need to take a closer look at his audience and their world. If we don't know anything about the context of Paul's letters, then his words make no sense or can be tragically misunderstood. Here's just one example of how assuming the wrong context can change the entire message. Anyone remember the movie Frozen? Now, if you have seen it, I want you to pretend that the clip I'm about to show you is your introduction to Frozen. And then try to get a sense of what you get from this trailer. And just quick warning, this trailer might be a little frightening. All the scenes are from Frozen, but if horror movies are not for you, go ahead and click out of this or fast forward for a little bit, and then I'll see you on the other side of that.
You know, most people who disappear into the mountains want to be alone.
Nobody wants to be alone. Except maybe you. Elsa? It's me.
Please, help! My daughter!
Do you want to build a snowman?
I recommend we remove all magic to be safe.
Snowman?
Elsa, what have you done?
What's left now, Steve? Kill Elsa.
Wasn't that just beautiful? Now, based on this trailer alone, you would think that Frozen is a horror movie that children under the age of 18 should probably not watch, and that the film is about a creepy child who wants to build a snowman. Snowman. Do you want to build a... Now, is that the message of Frozen about building creepy snowmen? No. Is Frozen actually for kids? Yeah. Are all these scenes made up or actually from the movie? Well, believe it or not, they all come from the movie Frozen. But what changes how we interpret the scenes is what? The context. In the wrong context, Frozen is an animated The Shining. In the right context, it is a beloved family movie that gets played over and over and over again. Anyways, same goes for Paul's letters. If we read them in the wrong context, then we get a Paul that never existed and a message that God never intended. And sometimes this can be really funny, like this Frozen trailer, and sometimes it can lead to some serious consequences. For instance, let's look at one of the more infamous letters from Paul. Turn with me to Ephesians chapter 6, verse 5 through 9. It says this: "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Jesus Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people. Because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slaves or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him." If all you had was this passage from Ephesians, then I hope you would agree with me and say that Paul is a monster. How can Paul, who loves and follows Jesus be okay with slavery? And sure, he says to the masters, don't threaten them, but honestly, wouldn't it be better if Paul said, free them? What's going on here? Is Paul pro-slavery? Well, the answer to that is no. And we'll see why in a bit, but let me just reiterate here that this is why context matters so much. When you don't consider context, you get poor and dangerous readings of the Bible, such as in the 19th century when plantation owners in the U.S. used this very passage, Ephesians 6, to justify slavery. Take this quote, for example. Does Jesus say to the master, having put yourself under my government, you must no longer hold your brother in bondage? Does he say to the slave, if your master does not release you, you must go and talk to him privately about this sin upon your rights under the law of my kingdom? And if he does not hear you, you must take 2 or 3 with you, and if he does not hear them with you, then you must tell it to the church and have him expelled from my flock as a wolf in sheep's clothing. Wow, that's a run-on sentence. I say, what does the Lord say to the poor believing slave concerning a master who held unlimited power over his person in life under the Roman law? He tells him that the very circumstance of his master's being a brother constitutes the reason why he should be more ready to do him service. That's from a pastor by the name of Thornton Stringfellow in 1850, using Ephesians 6 to justify slavery. So if you are not a Christian and you've wondered how Jesus followers are okay with scriptures that are pro-slavery or misogynistic or anti-Jewish or even homophobic, I want to be clear that we are not okay with any of that because the Bible, and in particular Paul, doesn't promote these values. And if you are a Christian, it's so important for our witness to Jesus that we get Paul right, that we get how Paul's words get twisted and how to resituate them in their proper context so that we can better communicate the good news of the gospel for the next generation. So how does context rescue Paul from being no better than a 19th century plantation owner? Well, here are a few things you should know about the first century. Slavery in the New Testament was very different from what we saw happening in the 19th century. The most common slave was an indentured servant, someone who would sell themselves into slavery until they could earn enough to obtain their freedom. Nearly 30% of people in the Roman Empire were slaves, and not a single person's status was based on their ethnicity, but their socioeconomic needs. Now, I'm not saying that's good slavery and that was bad slavery, because of course, humans are humans, and even indentured servitude had its issues. Slaves experienced abuse at the hands of the owners. There were unfair wages, and of course, hierarchically speaking, they were considered less. It's worth noting that Paul's words would have also shocked people in Ephesus too, but for different reasons. People would have gladly accepted Paul's instructions to the slaves to respect, fear, and serve their masters as if they were serving Jesus, but then they would have been a little shocked and confused, and they would have paused when Paul follows up with this. Masters, treat your slaves in the same way. In other words, Paul's saying, masters, respect, fear, and serve your slaves because you know who the real master is over them and over you. Paul's words here challenge the status quo of the Roman world, and in fact, calls for the transformation of the relationship between slave and master, considering who Jesus is and what he has done. Because Jesus is the ultimate master who gave his life away, served those who were less than him, and loved even his enemies, Paul is saying to the masters, you better do the same. I don't care what the norm might be. I don't care if your neighbor gets away with it. I don't care if it isn't illegal. How you treat your slaves better look like how Jesus treated you. Now, consider this. If masters respect, fear, and serve their slaves, and slaves do the same for their masters, what becomes of that relationship? Ideally, they are no longer a business relationship, but a family relationship. And this is what Paul is aiming at here. He's saying that in light of Jesus' resurrection, the relationship between master and slave in Ephesus must now become a relationship between two members of the same household. Because only then, when masters and slaves love one another and understand they are on the same team, only then are they ready to put on the full armor of God in the battle against the powers and principalities that want to convince them that one deserves more dignity than the other. So how did we go from reading Paul as pro-slavery to Paul as arguing for mutual submission and a radical reformation of the relationship between masters and slaves? Well, we got there by taking account of context. The last step to reading the epistles well is embodying the text in our own life. Now that you understand who Paul is, who he wrote to, and his message correctly read in its context, it's time to figure out how his instructions might apply to our faith journey. Sometimes this is really easy. When Paul says, don't be divisive or don't gossip, you don't need to take out a commentary and read Hebrew to figure out what he means. You just need to stop creating drama. But when Paul says, slaves and masters, love one another like Jesus loved you, we need to sit with that a little bit because nowadays, thank God, slavery in any form is illegal. And also, it is the task of the church to resist and fight against all types of human trafficking. We are completely against that. But you know what isn't illegal? Having someone who is dependent on you. If you are a landlord, your tenants depend on you. If you are an employer, your workers depend on you. If you are a supervisor, your subordinates depend on you. If you're a creditor, your debtors depend on you. You get the point. I don't need to list this on and on. Paul's teaching about master and slave relations might not apply 100%. But you know what does? That Jesus changes everything. Landlords, you collect rent, but Jesus allows you to live in his world rent-free. Employers, you hand out paychecks, but Jesus gives you your daily bread. Supervisors, you set expectations, but Jesus' way with you has always been grace. And creditors, you take what is owed, but Jesus paid the entirety of your debt. So considering what Jesus has done for you, as your landlord, as your employer, as your supervisor, and as your creditor, how will you treat those under your authority? How will you fear, respect, and serve the people who are most vulnerable in relationship to you? And on the flip side, for those of you in the place of dependence and vulnerability, how might you fear, respect, and serve those people who are often categorized as your enemies and whom you would rather not love for Jesus' sake? Whether you find yourself in positions of mastery or indebtedness, Paul's message to us today can be summed up like this. The task of a Christian is to take every worldly relationship and to make it an exhibit of God's transformative and redemptive love to make strangers and enemies families. So here's my encouragement to you as we wrap up today's message. Practice reading the Bible with context in mind because it can make all the difference in the world. Here's one way you can go about it this week. Number one, look up Philippians 4:13. Read just that verse and then write down what you think Paul is trying to communicate. Number two, read Philippians 4:10 through 12. Then note what Philippians 4:13 means in relation to those passages. And then number three, go watch this short video from the Bible Project to learn more about the historical context of this letter. The link is just right below me. And then number four, once you've watched that video, finally, answer these two questions. What does Philippians 4:13 mean when considering all of the context? And two, what does it look like to live out the message of Philippians 4:13 in my own life today? Take care and God bless. We'll see you next week.